Not only does the floating exchange rate system reduce export incomes, it has reduced the growth of world trade. By adjusting prices rather than income, the floating exchange rate system has reduced the growth of international trade. The implementation of such misguided and futile policies is likely to waste resources and slow the rate of economic growth. In my last video, we considered the growth of trade and the path to equilibrium under the fixed and floating exchange rate systems. In this video, we will be considering other factors related to the exchange rate systems and their effect upon economic growth. The first of these is the effect of the exchange rate system on the income of exporters. We saw this chart in my previous video. We used it to explain that under the floating exchange rate system, if exports rise from S1 to S2, the exchange rate rises from X1 to X2. That raises imports and thereby the supply of domestic currency to the foreign exchange market from $20 billion to $30 billion. We now look at a more specific example between two countries. We will assume that this chart represents the foreign exchange market of country A, which uses the floating exchange rate system. Also, we will assume that it is trading with country B, so that the exchange rate, which the vertical axis represents, is the amount of country B's dollars that we can buy for one of country A's dollars. We will assume that the exchange rate X1 was $1 dollar and that X2 was $1 dollar 20 cents. Now let us assume that there was an exporter in country A that sold their exports to country B for 120 million B dollars. When the exchange rate was $1 dollar for one A dollar, that exporter would have earned 120 million A dollars. But when the exchange rate rose to $1 dollar 20 cents for every A dollar, the exporter would have earned only 100 million A dollars. Their income was reduced by 20 million A dollars. That income reduction applies to all exporters that priced their exports in terms of foreign currency or had to take an international market price. Those exporters that had low profit margins may not be able to supply as much or continue in business. For example, in Australia, a boom in mineral exports raised the value of the Australian dollar above what it otherwise would have been. A likely effect of that is that the sheep industry, which mainly supplies exports of wool, lamb and mutton, has declined to less than 40% of what it was, from an industry with 180 million sheep in 1970 to just 70 million sheep in 2022. Not only does the floating exchange rate system reduce export incomes, it has reduced the growth of world trade. The shipbuilding industry was one of the first industries to collapse in the late 1970s after the widespread introduction of the floating exchange rate system among Western economies. The growth of world trade had slowed, and the ships that had been ordered to meet the anticipated growth in demand were no longer required. That reduced demand for shipping caused a crisis in the shipbuilding industry around the world, and particularly in the United Kingdom, Japan and West Germany. We can see the reason for that outcome in our analysis of the foreign exchange market. If we assume that country A had a fixed exchange rate system, we can compare that international trade outcome with what we saw for the floating exchange rate system. Under the fixed exchange rate system, we do not have a foreign exchange market as such. Instead, we have an international trade market. Instead of money being the traded commodity, it is exports and imports. We now refer to the vertical axis as relative prices rather than the exchange rate. We will keep the meaning similar to the exchange rate, so that the higher relative price means that the price of imports is cheaper, in the same way that a higher exchange rate meant that imports were cheaper. To do that means that we measure the price of domestic products relative to the price of imports. We will refer to these in the chart as the prices of country A relative to the prices of country B. The demand for foreign currency on the foreign exchange market is now the demand for imports, shown as the M1 line in the chart. The supply of foreign currency is now the demand for country A's exports. The original demand is shown as the X1X1 line, and the raised demand is shown as the X2X2 line. While we assume the same increase in demand for country A's exports, the exchange rate is fixed so that relative prices of imports and exports do not change. Therefore, the amount of exports demanded at the fixed exchange rate is now greater at $35 billion compared to $30 billion under the floating exchange rate system. Yet under the fixed exchange rate system, imports are initially at $20 billion. Therefore, trade is not balanced. However, the additional income from exports in country A raises the demand for imports. This, together with the multiplier effect that was discussed in the previous video, raises the income of country A. The multiplier will continue to raise income and raise the demand for imports until imports equal exports and we have equilibrium. We can see that under the floating exchange rate system, at equilibrium, both exports and imports have increased 50%, or by $10 billion. But under the fixed exchange rate system, at equilibrium, both exports and imports have increased 75%, or by $15 billion. Therefore, we can see that by adjusting prices rather than income, the floating exchange rate system has reduced the growth of international trade. This is evident in the United States of America, where, in the 11 years before the float, between 1961 and 1972, US trade, comprising both exports and imports, grew at an average rate of 7.2% per annum, doubling every 10 years. In the 11 years following the float, from 1972 to 1983, they grew at an average annual rate of 3.9%, doubling every 18 years. That is a 29% reduction in the average rate of growth and an 80% increase in the time taken to double the amount of trade. There may be times when international trade has grown faster than before the float. For example, minerals and oil may have been discovered and prompted the growth of trade. Likewise, new technology or discoveries may have spurred the growth of trade. However, such growth is unlikely to have been caused or assisted by the floating exchange rate system. The trade would have grown anyway, regardless of the exchange rate system. Even so, it's likely to have grown more under fixed than floating exchange rates. The slower rates of economic growth under the floating exchange rate system flow through to government, which is left with less revenue. Also, the demise of import competing and other industries causes unemployment, requiring government to increase spending on social security. This leaves government with less funds to spend on other things that may contribute to economic growth, such as education, health, and infrastructure. Therefore, the reduced funds available to government can reduce economic growth further. Another factor is when governments attribute the cause of the slow economic growth to something other than the real cause. In an attempt to raise the rate of economic growth, they misdirect their policies and their spending. These misguided policies may address the perceived problem, but they do not address the real cause. For example, following the announcement of the recession in the third quarter of 1973, President Richard Nixon addressed the people of the United States, advising them that restrictions were to be put in place to reduce the consumption of oil. That included the introduction of a maximum speed for motor vehicles of 50 miles per hour. In Australia, governments privatised and regulated public utilities in an attempt to make them more efficient. The policy was intended to reduce the cost of utilities to industry, enabling them to be more internationally competitive. In an environment of floating exchange rates and monetary independence, that was another misguided strategy. Also, it had the opposite effect to what was intended. It raised the price of utility services, thereby contributing to the cost of energy to industry and to a rise in the cost of living for the wider community. The implementation of such misguided and futile policies is likely to waste resources and slow the rate of economic growth. The effect upon economic growth should not be the only factor that is considered in determining the most suitable exchange rate system for a country. In his essay on the case for flexible exchange rates, Milton Friedman considered other factors besides prosperity. For example, he considered the exchange rate system should be suitable for the current economic and political conditions, not be rigid but freely determined in an open market by private dealings, allow the liberation of trade, that is, unrestricted multilateral trade that avoided restrictions and direct controls, allow the harmonisation of monetary and fiscal policies, and enable the pursuit by each nation of domestic economic stability, according to its own lights. In my next video, I will be considering some of the ways countries have sought to increase the rate of economic growth while applying the floating exchange rate system.